Welcome to what I watched this month. You get a 2-for-1 this time around, as I fell behind a little bit, so this is what I watched in July and August. As always, I will be discussing general plot synopses, but I will try to avoid any crucial ending spoilers.
There have been 4 movie versions of A Star is Born so far. I've seen the versions from 1954 and 2017, and now this one, from 1937, which features Janet Gaynor as a young wannabe actress and Frederick March as her alcoholic husband, whose star falls in Hollywood just as his wife's is rising. The two struggle with their relationship and his substance abuse while trying to navigate show business. This is the only one of the 4 versions that isn't a musical, but it does an amazing job of showing the characters themselves. Sometimes in these stories, it's hard to see why this couple loves each other, but it's so obvious here. There are so many scenes where they joke back and forth with each other, and it's clear that they get each other on some wavelength and enjoy each other's company. I've seen Gaynor in very little, but she is the epitome of the girl next door here. Sweet and charming and likable, but hardier than you might at first suspect. The scenes where paparazzi harass her even in the midst of tragedy hit hard, and you just want these characters to be alright. For the first time, I can see why this story spawned so many subsequent adaptations. Satantango is a 7-hour film from Hungarian director Béla Tarr about a poor village and its inhabitants. There are plot lines happening throughout, including multiple characters planning to steal from each other, a young girl's tragic death, and the return of some villagers everyone thought were dead, but it is, obviously from its length, mostly a long, slow film. This is absolutely not my style of filmmaking. I struggle with Tarkovsky's work, I struggled with this. Though there are definitely moments that worked for me. There were some very striking moments, especially the first time we see the Doctor. Tarr insists on capturing every possible moment of his character's actions, with very few cuts to a new scene, and with the Doctor in particular, I find that it effectively highlighted how slow and mundane his day was. He hardly ever leaves his home, just sitting around watching other people, and watching him slowly sort through his notebooks gives us a stronger sense of his life than we would get in a film more traditionally shot. That being said, it is a task to undertake this one, and I definitely was uninterested more than I was interested. Chaos Walking is a dystopian sci-fi story based on a book series by Patrick Ness, which I read last year and adored. The story centers around a young adult named Todd, whose family was part of an attempt to colonize a new planet. But when they arrived, they warred with the local inhabitants and came away with all the women dead and all the men cursed with their thoughts being audible. Enter Viola, one of the next wave of Earth arrivals, who has no idea what's happened on this new planet and does not end up being a welcome addition. I loved the book series. I found it engaging and thrilling and wonderful. This does a pretty good job of making the characters work. Tom Holland in particular is charismatic enough to still be likable, even as we hear his every thought spoken out loud, including his infatuation with and fantasies about Viola, but the movie falls extremely flat in its exposition, which is never doled out at the audience's pace, either rehashing things we've been told multiple times, or taking extraordinary leaps to reveal new truths we weren't anywhere near. That small detail ends up taking this world that was so fascinating in its original incarnation, and making it strange and confusing and ugly. Read the books, but skip this. Fear of a Black Hat is a 1994 mockumentary about a rap group called NWH. The H here stands for Hats. The filmmaker follows the group through their breakthrough, their breakup, and their reunion. One review I've read said that what Spinal Tap did for metal music, this does for hip-hop, and I think that's a pretty accurate comparison. The low-key mockumentary style of humor means that not every moment is hilarious, but the characters and the scenarios they're in are entertaining, with occasional bursts of hilarious genius. While I definitely don't have enough knowledge or experience in this scene to know if the satire always hits, so I could be reading it wrong, but to me it seems to do a pretty good job of satirizing the push for visible violence to maintain street cred, whether that's artists openly flaunting their actual violent acts, or non-violent artists pretending they have a past so they'll be respected. The music in this is also pretty enjoyable, if definitely very tongue-in-cheek. I knew nothing about this film going in, but I had a really good time with it, and I'm glad I got the push to seek it out as part of my 100 Movies from 1994 project. The Legend of Drunken Master is a sequel to a film from 16 years earlier. This time we follow Jackie Chan as a proponent of drunken boxing who ends up mistakenly in possession of a stolen artifact and has to restore it to its rightful owners. However, he has to hide this from his father for various reasons. The plot isn't really the point of this story anyway, any more than it was in the original. We're mostly just here to watch some goofy antics and enjoy some great martial arts stunts, and while it's heavier on the former than the latter, we get a good amount of both. Like the original film, I had a good time with it, but I couldn't for the life of me tell you anything about it once it was over. Trying to remember the film to name the plot here was a challenge enough, and I can really only recall 1 or 2 prominent sequences before the rest just kind of meshes together into a vaguely enjoyable blur. Definitely worth a watch if you're a fan of Jackie Chan or the genre of martial arts films in general, but I wouldn't say it's the best of either. The Piano is the story of a woman who moves to New Zealand with her daughter as a mail-order bride. The woman is psychologically mute and has not spoken since her daughter's father was killed in front of her. She does not warm to her new husband, especially after he trades her precious piano to a local for some land. The piano's new owner offers to let her play on it whenever she wants in exchange for sexual favors, and she agrees. While I'll remain vague about how it ends, there is so much about this movie that sets off uncomfortable alarm bells for me, especially in the dynamic between the woman and the two men she's involved with. It most certainly seems to be telling a specific story of a specific woman, specific, unique to her circumstances, rather than identifying what makes a relationship good or bad on the whole. But I certainly can't root for what the story ultimately wants me to root for, even when it seems that it's what the sympathetic main character maybe wants. It's a compelling story, but it's a troubling one, and while it tries to wrap it up neatly at the end, I remained troubled by it long after the credits rolled. Space Sweepers is set in a future where Earth is dying out, and our greatest hope is a new billionaire-built Eden of sorts, which is in progress but will only take a select few. Our protagonists are a group of rogues who find old space junk and haul it back for money, but one day they find a robot child wanted by the government, and as they try to figure out what to do with her, their interests collide with that of the government and the New Earth Project. This movie isn't quite as clever as it wants to be when it comes to its narrative, but the world setup does feel incredibly prescient. I watched this just a few days before the news was filled of billionaires buying their own spaceships and going to space, so that world feels only a decade or two away. Aside from that, though, it's a fairly by-the-book story that thinks it's saying much bigger things about humanity than it maybe actually is. A lot of the narrative beats fall right into the regular tough guys meet a child who changes them tropes, and most of that falls a little flat. Worth exploring the world, less worth exploring this particular narrative. Luca is Pixar's newest release, the story of two young sea monsters who disguise themselves as humans and go to explore the human world against the orders of the adults in their lives. They end up befriending a human girl and entering a triathlon to try and earn enough money to explore the human world on their own, but having to keep up their disguise turns out to be difficult. This is the first Pixar film I've seen in a while that felt decidedly for children. That isn't a bad thing by any means. Children deserve their own art too, and it deserves to be good, and this is definitely that. But it didn't really have any of the deeper, more complex moments I've come to expect from the studio based on their other films. No tugging at my heartstrings here, really. The characters are cute, the plot a well-structured one that definitely is reminiscent of The Little Mermaid. The sea monster design is delightful, and the relationships between the characters are relatable. I have no true complaints about it. It's a quality film, but I don't think I'm the audience here, and I don't embrace it as wholeheartedly as I might have as a child. Grand Illusion is a French-language film from 1937 about a group of French soldiers during World War I who are captured and sent to a German prisoner of war camp. The film examines a wide variety of themes through these characters, particularly the futility of war, which the title refers to, and the class system, which is examined in interactions between aristocrat prisoners versus prisoners who worked for a living. While on first glance this film doesn't resonate very deeply with me, it is very vital to remember the foundation it laid for other films I've seen before. There's a scene where the French soldiers defiantly sing La Marseillaise, and I immediately recognized the thread leading from this to a similar scene in Casablanca, one of my all-time favorite films. And virtually all great prison escape films owe a debt of gratitude to the characters and narrative spun here. I'm also intrigued by the relationship shown between the head of the camp and one of the more aristocratic prisoners, who form a bond around their shared understanding of class, even though they're on opposite sides of the war. I'm glad to have had the push to finally see this one. Man of La Mancha is a film adaptation of Broadway musical version of Don Quixote, here starring Peter O'Toole in the dual role of Miguel Cervantes in Don Quixote and Sophia Loren as the inmate Aldonza. While I've never seen the theatrical show, this is, as far as I understand, a pretty faithful adaptation of it, with nearly all songs intact. The songs are still powerful and beautifully crafted, but this film never quite holds together. Some of that is probably due to the less-than-stellar vocals provided by O'Toole and Loren, though Loren struggles more by far, which tamps down some of the grandiose nature of these songs. These characters sound the way they look, just regular everyday people with no special gifts, and that makes it a little harder to enter into Quixote's imaginary world of extraordinary beauty. Additionally, there's an unexpected amount of slapstick in this film, especially early on, with O'Toole giving comedic eye rolls to the camera just before falling over after an injury. It has some good moments, and some of the musical numbers actually work really well as standalone pieces, but it struggles to hold its vision together and never quite reaches greatness. The Last Dragon tells the story of a martial arts student who is searching for something to complete his training, and along the way he gets tangled up in a mobster's plot to force his girlfriend's music video onto the top 40 countdown, I think. This is not a terribly clear narrative, as you can gather from my hesitancy in describing it, but what it is a love letter to older martial arts movies. It clearly loves them so much and wants to do its own version with a black lead, and it's mostly successful in that. The characters are drawn in very broad strokes in the sense that you can gather who is good and bad instantly, even if their motives are a little bit muddier. And it's got quite a few moments that made me chuckle, particularly as our naive lead character interacts inside of his sort of Zen martial arts master persona, and the moments when those cross paths with the real world are charmingly goofy. I haven't yet mentioned our other antagonist, who I believe is a rival martial artist gang leader, who really takes on an outlandish, larger-than-life quality every time he appears on screen. None of this is my genre, really, but I enjoy what it tries to do.
The Last Seduction follows a woman who steals $750,000 from her husband and disappears. The money was acquired during a drug deal, so he can't track her down using regular law enforcement. We see her attempts to find a place where she can hide out until she can get away unscathed with all of it. She settles in a tiny Pennsylvania town and soon finds herself in a romantic relationship with an idealistic local. This has all the earmarks of your traditional femme fatale neo-noir, with one exception I can't quite explain. I love this character. Don't get me wrong, she is a terrible person, but it's just so fascinating to watch her work and see what she wants and how she plans to get it. Roger Ebert said in his review that the film knows how much we enjoy seeing a character work boldly outside the rules, and I think that captures it so perfectly. It's hard to feel much sympathy for the men in her life she's taking advantage of either, with their mean streaks and wobbly ethics, and she has so few qualms and is played so perfectly by Linda Fiorentino that this is kind of an exhilarating ride. Land is Robin Wright's directorial debut, about a middle-aged woman dealing with tragedy who shuts herself off in a remote cabin to survive or die as fate chooses. After fate nearly chooses death for her, she ends up getting unwanted help from a man who is also a survivor of tragedy, and the film follows her on her journey toward healing. This is a slow, thoughtful movie with an abundance of nature scenes. It takes on a unique tone, having a female protagonist, as nearly all hurt person becomes a hermit after losing their family stories are centered on men, and Wright's character here brings a different vibe to the movie. The film includes these long sequences with very little dialogue, where we just watch the character cope with her new life. And while part of me definitely zoned out a little bit in these scenes that feel like some sort of survivalist documentary, it also very nicely captures the ebb and flow of the time she spends there. At the end of the film, when she mentions that 2 years have passed since she moved in, that doesn't feel startling or unexpected, even though that time hasn't been marked through the film. It's not a film that speaks to my interests specifically, but it's well done, and it's worth a watch. Come and See follows a young boy in Belarus during World War II who joins the Belarusian resistance movement and sees the atrocities the German soldiers are inflicting on the people around him. The film has a mix of hyper-realism and surrealism that feels like a living nightmare, especially in those moments when it crosses from one to the other and you can't quite tell where you are yet. This is definitely not what you could call an enjoyable movie. It's difficult and unpleasant and at times just plain horrible to watch, but I think it accomplishes everything it sets out to do. I've seen enough war movies that I often find it too easy to see the strings pulling me to care, but this film broke through that and affected me on a deep emotional level. The use of sound and shots of people looking directly into the camera are especially effective, and 13-year-old Alexei Kravchenko, who plays the central character, is astonishing in the role, although reading about the making of the film made me uncomfortable with how hard they worked to get that performance out of him. Fortunately, he seems to be doing okay these days, and that caveat aside, this is a movie I'm glad I saw, even if I couldn't say I liked watching it. The Fugitive Kind is based on a Tennessee Williams play and stars Marlon Brando as a former seedy club musician who wants to turn over a new leaf and start a more wholesome life. So he travels to a new town and gets work at a general store with the owner's wife, a bitter woman caught in a clearly miserable marriage. As the two work together, their relationship gets more intense and drama ensues. Sidney Lumet is the director here, and he is such a great fit for Williams' work. He makes melodrama believable without taking away how larger-than-life it is, but instead he blends it all together almost seamlessly. Brando's steamy persona may work even better here than in his other Williams work I've seen, A Streetcar Named Desire, because here we sense that he really is a good person fighting old habits. And Anna Magnani is also truly wonderful as Lady Torrance. She garners a tremendous amount of sympathy for the terrible position in which she finds herself. It's not the finest work of any of the talented people involved here, but it is solid and worth checking out, especially if you're already a fan of Williams, Lumet, Magnani, or Brando. Possession is hard to explain. Isabella Gianni and Sam Neill star as a married couple who decide to break up after she begins seeing someone else. But also she might be literally possessed, or might be creating a monster, or he might be hallucinating the whole thing because he's clearly not okay either. They both behave erratically, a bunch of people are killed, a bunch of creepy stuff happens. So yeah, this is absolutely terrifying. This is one of those films where even if you're not entirely sure what's causing things to happen, you know that something is very wrong. I knew Ajani's performance was noteworthy going into this, and it absolutely is. It's one of the most unsettling things I've ever seen, particularly in that subway scene, but also through the whole thing. But Sam Neill is also deeply unsettling here, a character who acts with such sociopathy, but is completely unaware that there's anything wrong with him. I do wish I could grasp what the movie was trying to be about. I was fascinated by the wild and terrifying ride throughout their life, but it feels a little empty for me at the end. But it is undeniably effective, though, and while I don't particularly want to rewatch it, I'm glad I saw it. No Sudden Move follows a group of criminals tasked with getting a businessman to steal some important documents from his boss so they can steal them. One of the criminals, played by Don Cheadle, begins to suspect that there's more going on with this deal than he was at first told, and he starts to take matters into his own hands before they get out of control. Steven Soderbergh directed this movie, and it's definitely got some of his hallmarks. It's a slick, fast-paced heist crime story with unexpected moments of humor scattered throughout. Like many stories in this genre, I find myself getting tired of the endless twists and double crosses and new characters being introduced all the time, but this film does a good job of keeping an emotional center to the story and helping us navigate the world's twistiness through just one or two characters. Despite being set in the 1950s, it feels unusually modern. I kept genuinely forgetting it was a period piece until suddenly something would feel out of place and I'd remember where we were. It's pretty solidly put together, if not something that I'm going to remember a year down the line. The Sparks Brothers is a documentary by Edgar Wright detailing the decades-long musical career of the band Sparks, two brothers who have been putting out music together since the 1960s. The film interviews the two brothers, Ron and Russell Mael, as well as musicians, journalists, producers, and others who have been influenced by their work. I knew absolutely nothing about this band going into this film, but I came out of it thoroughly intrigued. This group has had widely varying degrees of commercial success throughout their career, but continued to push out music and experiment with new styles and sounds, sometimes resulting in wild shifts in tone from record to record. The film follows them chronologically, so even as the music changes, we get to see how one led to the next and led to the next, which made for a beautifully cohesive way of understanding their work. Wright is, of course, a fantastically energetic director and turns out to be a great fit for this genre-pushing, norm-defying group, as he shapes their saga with such enthusiasm for the work they did. I definitely intend to listen to some more of this group, but watching Wright nerd out about them for 2 hours was a great way to catch the spirit of what they were doing. Pacific Rim is a Guillermo del Toro action movie about a world in which enormous monsters, or kaiju, if you're a fan of Japanese monster movies, emerge from the sea to attack human cities. To defend themselves, the humans create giant mechs that must be piloted by at least 2 people. However, the monsters are only getting bigger and stronger, leading to the mech program ending, and now there's a last-ditch effort to use the remaining mechs to close off the monsters' entrance. We follow several of these pilots, as well as the scientists and military men keeping the whole operation running. So if you mostly tune into this movie expecting some big, dramatic, kinda cool scenes of giant monsters fighting giant robots, you're gonna be very pleased. If you tune into it expecting powerful character development or a spooky gothic atmosphere like many of Del Toro's other movies, it might not do so well. I find the male lead in particular pretty insufferable and wish almost anybody but him in this ensemble cast had been chosen to center the movie. Writing up this review a few days after watching it, all I really remember is the fight scenes, and that's probably all it was meant to do, but I did find myself wanting more from it. Kid 90 is a documentary focusing on 80s and 90s child star Soleil Moon Frye and her life growing up in the spotlight. Not only was she in the spotlight with her acting work, but she also had a video camera of her own and obsessively documented her and her friends' lives. As an adult, Frye watches her old videos, reads her old diaries, and interviews her childhood friends to provide commentary on life as a teenager in the public eye at the turn of the millennium. It's fun to see clips of her hanging out with friends as a youngster, especially the ones who then went on to become superstars, like a very young Leonardo DiCaprio appears a few times. These candid videos show so clearly that these trendy young actors were still just goofy teenagers, as of course they were, with all the emotions that come along with that. And the film works great as a time capsule of that era of early to mid-90s tech kids. Where it falters is in Frye's attempts to make this a thoughtful film about friendship or loss. There's not really a clear through line or end goal in her searching through her past records, so it comes across more meandering than anything, but it is pretty short, so the time capsule nature carries it along. The Italian Job had a 2003 remake, but this time I watched the original, featuring Michael Caine as the mastermind behind an elaborate job that involves creating a traffic jam to steal gold from an armored truck. The humor in this is its strongest feature. The chaos of all the moving pieces of the heist is always just moments away from being a zany cartoon, and that keeps it enjoyable throughout most of it. It's interesting to note the pieces of this that have entered the zeitgeist. I didn't realize until the actual moment it was said that this is the movie that "you're only supposed to blow the bloody doors off" came from. Given the somewhat madcap nature of the film, I was also interested to see how it would end, and it did not disappoint. I wouldn't have predicted that ending, but it's absolutely perfect, and it fits so well tonally with the rest of it. In fact, I like the ending so much that I'd say that pushes it up a couple notches from what would have otherwise been an entertaining but forgettable crime comedy. This is pretty solid, and worth a watch, especially if this is anywhere near your genre. Summer of Soul, or When the Revolution Could Not Be Televised, is a documentary about the Harlem Cultural Festival, held the same year as Woodstock and heavily filmed, but the footage was never released. This film includes footage from the festival itself, interviews from the present day with those involved, and information about the political and cultural situation in which the festival was held, to put everything in context. These are big names in the musical world, and it is truly delightful to see so many full musical performances from them. The film does a really great job of showing how these artists fit into the culture as well. One day of the festival focused solely on gospel music, and we learn about the culture of the Black church in America alongside the music. We get commentary on the distinction between black and white music in the 60s as we feature the Fifth Dimension, a band of black singers who were sometimes critiqued for sounding too white and weren't sure they'd be welcome. We learn about the way black Americans felt distant from their country as we see them react, or rather not react, to the moon landing when it happened during this time. It's a fascinating literal time capsule and worth a watch for sure. Find Me Guilty stars Vin Diesel as Jackie DiNorsio, one of the defendants in the real-life case that was the longest mafia trial in American history. DiNorsio is being brought to trial along with over a dozen of his colleagues for racketeering, and he chooses to represent himself. Much of the dialogue is taken directly from court transcripts, a fact that they tell you at the beginning of the movie, but that I forgot about until researching a little bit to write this review, and that took me by surprise, because the dialogue feels heavy-handed. Diesel isn't great in this film. He's not much of a dramatic actor, but I don't feel like he pulls off the comedy here either, and he always seems to be very self-consciously performing. Additionally, it's hard to know who to actually root for. I think we're supposed to identify more strongly than I did with DiNorsio's "I don't snitch on my friends" code, but my sympathies often lay with the prosecuting attorney, who was devastated by the harm this family had done and just wanted it to stop, and a few awkward jokes from DiNorsio in court don't make me forget that. Kind of a weird, messy movie. I expected more from Sidney Lumet. Red Christmas is a holiday slasher film about a family in Australia getting together for the holiday when a mysterious cloaked figure shows up at their front door claiming to be their mother's baby who survived an abortion attempt and wants to reunite with the family. When the family is not interested, the figure begins to take revenge on them one by one. Despite this being what sounds like the plotline of a pro-life propaganda film, the movie doesn't actually seem to be tackling this from a political angle as much as just a silly slasher one. Or at least if it's trying to have a viewpoint, it does it very poorly. It lightly toys around with the idea of whether or not she was wrong to try to get an abortion, but mostly it's just about watching these people die. Therein lies the problem, though. The movie is so generic in its slasher vibe, it doesn't successfully set stakes for any of its characters on a personal level, and it's hard to ever be very scared for them when they're just deciding to sit inside the house and wait for the killer to come in and get them. So for me, it fails as both possible satire and horror. Pig stars Nicolas Cage as a former chef who now lives as a hermit in the woods with his precious truffle pig. One day the pig is stolen, and Cage and his truffle dealer middleman go on the hunt. For what seems at first glance like yet another movie in the vein of John Wick or Taken, this movie goes in a very different direction, although I can't reveal most of the plot details without getting spoilery. I will say that it takes on a much less action-centric and more thoughtful, drama-centric tone, and one that centers much more around the love of the culinary arts than one man's quest for vengeance. Cage does a great job centering this as well. I thought I knew exactly what this movie was going to be based on the first 15 minutes, and then it subverts it all to go in a completely different direction that I found way more engaging and thought-provoking. I don't know that I'll remember this movie forever, but it was refreshing and creative and definitely worth at least one watch. The Dissident is a documentary about Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist who spoke up frequently against his own government and then was killed for it in the Saudi embassy in Turkey. I remember when the story came out, but I didn't dig into it too deeply at the time, so I was glad to get a chance to learn a bit more about it a few years later. The documentary goes through Khashoggi's writing and involvement with various activist groups, how the story about his death unfolded, and the response, or lack of response, from the rest of the world. It's more than a little frustrating to see how hesitant so many world leaders were to condemn this, because it was more politically and monetarily advantageous to look the other way, or downplay it. The film ends on a pretty dour note, understandably, highlighting that political abuses only get worse when they don't face any repercussions. While I don't know the situation well enough to know whether or not this film was fully accurate, it did cite its sources, which I appreciated, and I came away feeling like I knew more about the scenario than I did going in, which is the point of a documentary in many ways. North stars Elijah Wood as a young boy who feels he's not getting the attention from his parents that he rightly deserves, so he petitions the court to let him pick a new family. The court says sure, but if he doesn't find new parents or return to his old ones by an arbitrary deadline, he'll have to go to an orphanage, and thus the hunt for the new family is on. I only knew this film from its notorious reputation as being a movie that Roger Ebert passionately hated, and I don't know that it deserves that level of vitriol. There are a couple of moments where the goofy comedy almost works, which is more than I can say for plenty of other films trying just as hard. That being said, no, it's not good. His search across the world for new parents includes some incredibly unpleasant racial stereotypes, and the constant string of cameos and guest actors is an obvious grab for attention in a movie that doesn't deserve it, and North himself is a really unlikable character whose complaint with his parents feels less based in loneliness or wanting love, and more in a sense of, I'm special, why don't people treat me like I'm special? I'm glad to have scratched this one off the list, and now it can stay that way. Sweet Dreams is a Patsy Cline biopic, starring Jessica Lange as Patsy and Ed Harris as her husband Charlie, with whom she has a tumultuous on and off, hot and cold marriage through the whole film. Like many biopics, this one feels less like a story and more like an information dump, especially given the fact that the subject of this biopic dies tragically young, and since the story didn't really have a narrative through line so much as a bunch of random songs and scenes from Cline's life, it doesn't have any idea how to resolve the story when she isn't around. What do we take from her work? What do we take from her life? It's hard to tell. What I can tell you, though, is that Jessica Lange is a gosh darn delight as Cline. She imbues her with not only the confidence and the feistiness that you'd expect from the character, but also a deep sense of goodwill toward everyone around her and a willingness to not take herself too seriously. It's probably why her marriage to Charlie lasts as long as it does. She's often able to let his short-tempered rants roll right off her back, though of course there comes a point where that's not enough. It's fine, it's a serviceable biopic. Check it out if you want. The Offence stars Sean Connery as a long-serving police officer who becomes obsessed with finding the kidnapper of a young local girl, ultimately focusing his sights on one person he's convinced is the culprit. I won't go into much detail about how it turns out, except to say that the film focuses heavily on the toll this job takes on Connery, and how that makes him perhaps unfit to do his job here. Years of working homicide have left him with what we would now recognize clearly as PTSD, but he only speaks of it in terms of having all these pictures in his head that won't leave him alone. Sidney Lumet was so gifted at narrowing in on one character's psyche, and he does that beautifully here. I don't think I've seen a finer performance from Sean Connery. It's a slow burn as we see more and more of the characters unraveling, and by the time we get to the end, the tension is high. The film is based on a stage play, which makes complete sense to me, as it unfolds in essentially a series of two-person scenes, but the writing, directing, and acting keeps it from ever feeling like more should be happening. Definitely worth checking out. For a Few Dollars More features Clint Eastwood and Lee Van Cleef as rival bounty hunters in the Old West who form an uneasy alliance to hunt down a notorious bandit and his gang. This is the second movie in Sergio Leone's unofficial Dollars trilogy, and the last one I had to see. Given the fact that I loved The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, but was bored out of my mind during A Fistful of Dollars, I had no idea what to expect from this one. Turns out, it's right in the middle for me. The relationship between Eastwood and Van Cleef's characters is what centers it best for me. All the hallmarks of Leone's other films are there, from Ennio Morricone's haunting and wonderful score to some really stunning cinematography, but in the end, it is just in the middle for me. It's not as captivating a story as its successor, nor as thoughtful, nor as full of compelling dialogue. As someone who always struggles to find her way into a Western, I was simultaneously impressed with how well it did, and slightly saddened it didn't make it further. You may enjoy it more if this is your genre. The Tomorrow War is a sci-fi action thriller in which humans from 30 years in the future show up to recruit current-day soldiers for their fight with a planet-ending species of aliens. One of these soldiers is Chris Pratt. I was going to say more about his role in this movie, but he's mostly just kind of there. He and his character development, or lack thereof, is definitely the weakest part of this movie, which is otherwise a pretty cool concept, and I was actually very unsettled, in a good way, with the design of the aliens. You can't quite track how their bodies fit together, which is creepy enough that I could always totally buy into them. But along the way, there's also an attempted father-daughter plotline that ends up being seriously underwhelming at best and heavy-handed and irritating at worst, and some ensemble character development that doesn't really go anywhere, although Sam Richardson is really great in a side role. The film also struggles with pacing, with the final 30 minutes feeling wholly unnecessary as well as confusing. They spent all this time making a weapon to kill the aliens and then they just end up punching them to death anyway? It's a messy and awkward story, which is disappointing. Gunpowder Milkshake stars Karen Gillan as the daughter of a hired assassin who disappears when Gillan is a teenager. She's left in the care of her mother's employer and grows up to become a hired assassin as well. After 2 kills that don't go as planned, she finds herself on the run with a kid. I appreciate what this movie was going for. There are hundreds of these kinds of movies out there, and next to none of them have an awesome cast of ladies helming the team. This is a perfectly serviceable, but not all that exciting addition to that list. Aside from the great group of women involved, and make no mistake, it is frequently a delight to see them kicking butt left and right, there's not a lot else special about this movie. The abandoned child subplot is pretty underdeveloped, and the only action scene that stands out choreography-wise is the one where Gillan's hands are numb and she has to fight with knives taped to them. That's pretty great. And it's probably enough to win over fans of the genre to begin with, and I don't regret watching it, but it's not as memorable as I wish it were. Val is a documentary/memoir of sorts about Val Kilmer's career, told primarily through the videos he himself took as he was growing up as a star. This is now the second documentary I've seen released in 2021 with the premise of, this celebrity will look back through their home videos with us after Kid 90. Val is a much more compelling one, perhaps partly because he had a wider breadth of career to examine, but mostly because it does actually put forth a narrative of sorts. It's centered around Kilmer's continual search for his one great part, and then just when he finds it, he loses it all too quickly to throat cancer, which takes his voice from him almost completely. Most of the film is narrated by Kilmer's son, Jack, whose voice does bear a striking resemblance to his father's. I do wish the film had dedicated a bit more time to the rumors of him being difficult to work with. They touched on it just enough to make a point of it and then rushed past it, which felt even more awkward than if they'd chosen to ignore it completely. This is a little long for someone only a moderate fan of Kilmer's work, but it is a decent watch. It's fairly interesting. Werewolves Within stars Sam Richardson as a park ranger who is reassigned to a small town in the midst of fierce infighting about whether or not the inhabitants should sell their land to make way for an oil pipeline. Strange things start happening, people and animals start disappearing, and the tensions rise as we begin to suspect there may be a monster among them. This is a wild, silly ride of a film, and I never quite knew what to expect from it, but that was half the fun. The comedy is seldom as overt as it is in most horror parodies. It's clearly there, but the film plays its wild characters surprisingly straight, and it's definitely happy to lean into the horror part of its story just as much. It honestly kept me guessing the whole way through, which is something I didn't expect from this at all. And for a cast of names I mostly didn't know, the few I did were sitcom staples, it is a wonderfully strong ensemble cast, building up these tiny characters into clear personalities in a short amount of time. This isn't the most amazing horror comedy out there, but it is solid all the way through. Wrong Turn is a strange amalgamation of Deliverance, Taken, and The Wicker Man. We follow 2 protagonists, a college-age woman who goes on a hiking trip in the Appalachians with a group of friends, and her father, who is trying to hunt her down several weeks after she disappears. The college kids have run across a group of mountain dwellers who may or may not be villainous. For most of this movie, I was kind of rolling my eyes. It's cheesy and jump-scary, and it's got so many gory shots that seem gratuitous. And then the movie takes an interesting left turn in the final 30 minutes, and an even more interesting one in the final 30 seconds, during which the ending of the story plays out while the credits roll. And not epilogue stuff. This is like the climactic scene of the movie happens with credits scrolling past. I found myself, to my complete surprise, very moved by this. It takes the over-the-top scenario we've been presented with this whole story and suddenly unexpectedly highlights how awful this would be. It's still not a great movie, but it jumps itself up a half star or so with such a strong ending. Stargate is a sci-fi movie starring James Spader as a scholar of ancient languages who is brought in to decipher the hieroglyphs on a mysterious device found in an archaeological dig in Egypt. The device turns out to be some sort of portal to another planet, and Spader, along with a group of military men led by Kurt Russell, have the chance to step through the portal and learn about what's on the other side. I haven't seen any of the television shows inspired by this story, but it is easy to see why this story inspired more. There's a lot of ancient aliens conspiracy theory stuff in here that makes for adventurous storytelling, and there's a definite 90s cheesy charm to this, seen in the characterization, the dialogue, the score, the visuals. That's fairly enjoyable. It does require some serious suspension of disbelief, and it does that kind of thing where it hints that military action and colonizing might be potentially a bad thing on this new world, but it doesn't actually explore those concepts. Makes me wonder if the TV shows are more willing to explore the ramifications of space travel beyond just, ooh, this planet has weird-looking camel creatures. Damn Yankees is a musical about a man who sells his soul to the devil in order to become a world-class baseball player for his favorite team, the Washington Senators, and help them win the American League pennant. He learns pretty quickly that fame might not be for him, but the devil doesn't want to let him out of his contract. This is a pretty goofy premise, and this plot does not hold up if you look at it with anything resembling scrutiny. For many classic age musicals, the plot is mostly just an excuse for a fun series of song and dance numbers anyway. And those numbers here are pretty great, thanks largely to Bob Fosse's exciting and compelling choreography. It's hard to choose a favorite. I think I'd have to give the nod to the two big ensemble numbers, Shoeless Joe from Hannibal Moe and Two Lost Souls. That being said, the songs aren't quite enough to make me forget how bad the plot is. It's paper thin, with zero logical character development, and the conflict just gets abruptly resolved at the end for no reason. I kept thinking there weren't enough songs to drown it out, but it turns out there are so many, they're just not good enough. This isn't one to prioritize.